Thanks for tuning in to this episode of History's Greatest Battles. As always, if you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them. First off, my apologies for the 2-week delay in episodes. I've just returned from a couple weeks in Italy with my wife exploring battlefields, early Etruscan sites, and Roman areas of interest in preparation for Season 2. Secondly, in today's episode, we're going to explore one of the most fascinating moments in all of the Napoleonic Wars, a moment that the aftermath of which shaped the 19th century in Europe. Let's now experience the battles of Jena and Auerstadt.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 79, The Battles of Jena and Auerstadt, the 14th of October, 1806. French forces, 70 to 80,000 soldiers. Prussian forces, estimated at around 155,000 soldiers. The disastrous Prussian defeat at Jena and Auerstadt in 1806 was more than a humiliation. It was a reckoning. In the ashes of their shattered military, Prussia saw the urgent need for reform. The old system, built on outdated doctrines and rigid hierarchy, was swept away. At the heart of this transformation was the creation of the General Staff System, a revolutionary institution that replaced privilege and pedigree with merit, expertise, and meticulous planning. This system became the engine of the Prussian military's rebirth, ensuring it was led by the most talented minds, trained to anticipate and respond to the complexities of modern warfare. The results were undeniable. Over the next century, the Prussian military emerged as the most formidable force in Europe, its dominance confirmed by stunning victories against Denmark, Austria, and France. The General Staff became the model for every major military power, reshaping the very nature of command and strategy in the modern age. What began as Prussia's greatest disaster ultimately became the foundation of its greatest strength, cementing its military legacy for generations to come.
In 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte, a man whose ambitions knew no borders, stood unrivaled in power and military prowess. That year, his dream of invading Great Britain was stymied, but he was not one to let an army sit idle. He turned his soldiers toward continental Europe, wielding them like a master craftsman with tools honed for destruction. The campaigns of Ulm and Austerlitz would stand as testaments to his unmatched genius. At Ulm, on the 20th of October, Austrian General Mack found himself encircled so completely, so mercilessly, that surrender was his only option. Defeat came without even the dignity of battle. But Ulm was merely the overture. On December the 2nd, at Austerlitz, Napoleon's legions annihilated the combined forces of Austria and Russia, breaking them on the field with an elegance that was as ruthless as it was masterful. The Austro-Russian alliance unraveled in the aftermath, but the shadow of Prussia loomed large over the battle's outcome. Their indecision, urged to join the alliance but paralyzed by hesitation, left Austria and Russia vulnerable. And their defeat at Austerlitz was the price paid for that inaction. In the months leading up to Austerlitz, Prussian King Frederick Wilhelm III dithered, caught in a web of uncertainty. He feared Austria might strike a separate peace, leaving him exposed, and so he hesitated, frozen by his own doubts while the tides of history surged around him. Napoleon, a cunning diplomat, dangled a tempting prize before Frederick William, an alliance with France, and the rich spoils of Hanover. But the Prussian court was divided. The warhawks scoffed at the notion of bending their kingdom to Napoleon's will, and the king's indecision deepened the fissures. Frederick William's wavering was more than a personal failing. It was a betrayal of his supposed allies. His hesitation sealed the fate of Austria and Russia at Austerlitz, their armies crushed, while Prussia stood idle. In the wake of Austerlitz, Frederick William's ambitions got the better of him. His desire for Hanover overcame his reluctance, and Prussia finally accepted Napoleon's offer, an alliance born of greed, not conviction. But there was a complication Frederick William could not ignore. Great Britain also laid claim to Hanover, a territory deeply entwined with its royal family. The stage was now set for further discord, even as Prussia's alliance with Napoleon took shape. In early 1806, Britain entered delicate negotiations with Napoleon, haggling over territories in Italy and Germany. Napoleon hinted at restoring Hanover to Britain, weaving yet another thread into his complex diplomatic web. Napoleon, who was known as a tyrant in negotiations, compelled Prussia to cede the Duchy of Cleves and submit to the infamous Continental System. This economic stranglehold was designed to isolate Britain by severing its trade ties with the entire continent, binding even reluctant allies like Prussia to the emperor's will. The threat of losing Hanover, coupled with the economic ruin promised by Britain's retaliatory trade restrictions, roused Frederick William from his stupor. At last, he turned to the war faction in his court, throwing Prussia into the storm. Bolstered by 20,000 troops from their Saxon allies, the Prussians raised an army over 200,000 soldiers strong, a force that, on paper, seemed formidable enough to challenge the French juggernaut. Prussia's sudden turn toward hostility reverberated across Europe, reaching Russia as it engaged Napoleon in talks over territorial claims in Italy. The shifting alliances sowed uncertainty in every capital. Napoleon's proposal to Russia was as calculated as it was audacious. He would solidify his dominance in Italy, grant Russia unchecked influence in the Balkans, and pull French troops from German soil. It was a gamble meant to pacify the Tsar while consolidating his empire. The sight of a hostile Prussia emboldened Tsar Alexander to spurn Napoleon's offer. He turned his attention to Frederick William instead, though any hope of Russian aid was a distant mirage too far to arrive in time. For decades, the Prussian army had been Europe's gold standard, a symbol of precision and power, forged under the iron will of Frederick the Great. Its name alone commanded respect on every battlefield. During the mid-18th century, Frederick the Great transformed Prussia into a kingdom worthy of fear and admiration, wielding the disciplined army he had inherited from his father, Frederick I, with unmatched skill. Through the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, Frederick the Great displayed an uncanny mastery of strategy, outmaneuvering foes at every turn. His soldiers, forged into machines of obedience under his relentless discipline, executed his commands with unflinching precision. But this system, brilliant as it was, bore a fatal flaw. It demanded a leader of Frederick's caliber. After his death, no successor rose to match his vision or command his army with the same brilliance. The army retained its form, but its spirit had withered in the absence of strong leadership. Yet the myth of its greatness persisted, and Napoleon had not yet tested his mettle against so storied a foe. Napoleon understood the truth that others feared to say aloud. Prussia's leaders, from Frederick William to his generals, were trapped in the past, clinging to the outdated doctrines of Frederick the Great. Meanwhile, Napoleon's forces were redefining the very art of war. Betting on the rigidity of his enemy's tactics, Napoleon dismissed Frederick William's ultimatum on October the 7th, daring the Prussian king to act. Within a single week, Napoleon shattered the illusion of Prussian invincibility, exposing their once vaunted army as a relic unfit for the modern battlefield. Napoleon had long anticipated this confrontation. When news reached him on September the 18th, 1806, that the Prussians had crossed into Saxony 5 days prior, he wasted no time. His plans, meticulously prepared, were set in motion with the swiftness of a predator closing on its prey. Gathering his forces near Bamberg and Bayreuth along the main river, Napoleon unleashed his army on October the 8th, advancing northward in 3 coordinated columns through the dense and shadowed expanse of the Thuringian forest. His target was Gera, the critical junction where he believed the fractured Prussian forces would unite, an opportunity for Napoleon to shatter them before they could even consolidate. On the path from Bamberg to Gera lay the town of Jena, perched 20 miles east of Weimar, a location destined to become the crucible of Prussia's undoing. At Jena, Prince Frederick Hohenlohe established his position, joined shortly after by the Duke of Brunswick and Frederick William himself, who gathered their scattered forces just north of the town on October the 13th. Faced with Napoleon's relentless advance, the Prussians resolved to retreat toward the Elbe River, Prussia's western frontier. Hohenlohe was tasked with holding the line, positioning his forces between Jena and Kapellendorf as a rearguard to shield the army's withdrawal through Auerstadt, 12 miles north. When prisoners revealed the Prussians' positions, Napoleon made his decision with characteristic audacity. He would split his army in two, confident in his ability to outmaneuver his enemies on multiple fronts. Napoleon himself would command a force marching up the Saale River toward Jena, while Marshal Louis Devoe would take a parallel route northward, skirting Jena and pressing toward the Elbe River. This maneuver gave Napoleon a lethal flexibility. Devoe's troops could cut off the Prussian retreat if they fled, or strike their exposed flank if they dared to make a stand. By the afternoon of October the 13th, Napoleon reached the southern outskirts of Jena. Scouts confirmed his suspicion. The main Prussian force was entrenched on a plateau west of the town, a position that would soon become a trap of their own making. Napoleon prepared to use October 14th to position his forces, setting the stage for a decisive confrontation on the morrow. Before dawn on October the 14th, Napoleon strode through his camps, speaking directly to his soldiers, his words igniting their resolve and reminding them that they were the cutting edge of history itself. The morning was cloaked in thick fog, but even through the murk, the Saxons fighting under the Prussian banner heard the unmistakable cry of "Viva l'Empereur" echoing across the fields, a sound that sent a shiver through their ranks. That cry unnerved not only the Saxons, but also their commander, Hohenlohe, who had convinced himself that the French force before him was nothing more than a small vanguard. The truth would hit him like a thunderclap. In the fog of war, literal and figurative, both Napoleon and Hohenlohe misjudged the strength of the forces before them, though only one would have the chance to correct his mistake. Napoleon believed he was confronting the entirety of the Prussian army, unaware it was only their rearguard. Hohenlohe, on the other hand, realized too late that the force before him was no mere advance party. It was nearly the full might of the French army bearing down on him. At 6 a.m., under the cover of thick morning fog, the French troops moved into position, their silent march a harbinger of the chaos to come. By 9 a.m., the French had stormed and secured their initial objectives, seizing the villages ahead of them with ruthless efficiency. Napoleon ordered his forces to halt and reassemble, ensuring cohesion before the next phase of the battle. General Townshend's advanced Prussian force bore the brunt of the French assault, suffering devastating losses. What remained of his troops fell back to rejoin Hohenlohe's main force, reorganizing as a desperate reserve. Hohenlohe scrambled to reinforce his lines, desperately summoning troops to hold the French advance. Both he and Napoleon maneuvered their armies into position, each preparing for the decisive clash that was now inevitable. But the battle erupted prematurely, sparked by the fiery impatience of Marshal Ney, whose hunger for glory burned hotter than Napoleon's carefully laid plans. Ney, determined to carve his name into the annals of the day's victory, unleashed an aggressive assault on the Prussians entrenched in the village of Viersenheiligen, unwilling to wait for the battle to unfold on Napoleon's terms. Ney's rash attack forced Napoleon's hand. Additional French troops surged forward to bolster the assault, quickly overwhelming the defenders and seizing the village. But as the smoke cleared, they were met by the full brunt of the Prussian front line, standing exposed in the open fields beyond. The French fell back into the shelter of the village, turning its narrow streets and sturdy buildings into defensive strongholds from which they unleashed devastating volleys on the exposed Prussian ranks. The iron discipline drilled into the Prussian army since the days of Frederick I held firm, but it was this very rigidity that became their undoing. For 2 grueling hours, the Prussian soldiers stood, unwavering, under a relentless storm of musket and artillery fire, sacrificing their lives in staggering, absurd numbers as their lines crumbled. While the Prussians endured the merciless bombardment, Napoleon seized the moment. He unleashed his forces against both flanks of the Prussian line, aiming to envelop and annihilate. By midday, Napoleon gave the signal for a full-scale advance. The shattered Prussian ranks, already teetering on the brink, were driven back in disarray across the battlefield. Hohenlohe, grasping for control, ordered a retreat northwest, but what began as an organized withdrawal quickly disintegrated into chaos as discipline collapsed under the weight of the French pressure. The Prussian army's only hope of avoiding complete annihilation lay with reinforcements en route from Weimar, their fate hinging on whether those fresh troops could hold back the French tide. But the reinforcements arrived too late. They marched straight into the jaws of a triumphant French force, which obliterated them in mere minutes. By 4 p.m., the French pursuit had become relentless, sweeping across the battlefield. Only the Saxons, defiant to the last, mounted any meaningful resistance, standing firm as they were cut down where they fought. It was only after his triumph at Jena that Napoleon discovered the truth. The shattered force he had defeated was not the main Prussian army. That fight raged to the north, where Marshal Davout faced the lion's share of Prussia's strength at Auerstadt. Marshal Davout, originally tasked with flanking Hohenlohe, found himself in a far more perilous position. With just 26,000 troops, he stood toe-to-toe against a Prussian army of over 50,000 soldiers, a numerical disparity that would have unnerved a lesser man. As dawn broke at 6 a.m., dense fog cloaked their battlefield near the village of Hasenhausen. The French and Prussian armies collided, neither side fully prepared for the deadly encounter that unfolded in the mist. In the chaos of the fog, Davout swiftly deployed his leading division. When the mist lifted, his troops faced a whirlwind of Prussian cavalry charges, 4 in total. Each was repelled with unflinching discipline and lethal efficiency. The Prussian reinforcements surged forward, adding weight to their assault. Yet, momentum faltered as catastrophe struck. The Duke of Brunswick, their commander, was struck down mid-battle, leaving their army leaderless at their most critical moment. Chaos gripped the Prussian ranks. King Frederick William, lacking both military acumen and the courage to act decisively, froze in the face of the disaster. With no one to assume command, the Prussian army floundered, directionless and vulnerable. Desperate to turn the tide, the Prussians launched wave after wave of cavalry assaults, but each charge shattered against the unyielding French infantry squares. Routed and demoralized, the Prussians fell back toward Auerstadt, 3 miles southwest of Hasenhausen. As the Prussians scrambled to retreat, French forces had advanced to deadly positions along their flanks. Artillery batteries opened fire, unleashing a punishing barrage that tore through the retreating columns. Frederick William, paralyzed by indecision, refused to deploy his reserve cavalry to stem the French advance. By noon, he ordered a full retreat toward Hohenlohe, unaware that Hohenlohe's own forces were already in full flight, scattering in disarray. When the two retreating Prussian forces converged, the scale of their collective disaster became clear. Panic swept through the ranks, turning retreat into chaos. Frederick William and Queen Louise abandoned their shattered army and fled to Berlin, leaving their soldiers to their fate. In a single day, the mighty Prussian army, once the pride of Europe, had all but ceased to exist, reduced to little more than a memory amid the carnage. The French inflicted a staggering toll. Nearly 25,000 Prussians lay dead or dying, and an equal number were taken prisoner. What remained of the Prussian army dissolved entirely, its remnants vanishing into the countryside, scattered and broken beyond recognition. The French seized the entirety of the Prussian artillery, 200 gleaming cannons, once the pride of the kingdom, now trophies of their humiliation. For all their triumph, the French losses were remarkably light, 4,000 at Jena and another 7,000 at Auerstadt, a small price for such an overwhelming victory. French forces swept the countryside, hunting down the scattered Prussian survivors. Meanwhile, Napoleon, commanding half his army, marched triumphantly into Berlin on October the 27th, unopposed and unchallenged. Napoleon extended terms to Frederick William, but the Prussian king, clinging to a fragile hope, refused. A message from Tsar Alexander promised reinforcements, 140,000 Russian troops, if only the king could stand his ground. But Alexander's promises were empty. Within a month, Napoleon's forces had overrun every Prussian fortress, capturing an additional 100,000 men and extinguishing any hope of a meaningful defense. Despite the devastation, Frederick William clung to what little remained of his kingdom. From his refuge in East Prussia, he scraped together a ragged force to join the Russians in one last stand. At Eylau in February of 1807, the combined Prussian and Russian forces managed to hold Napoleon's army to a bitter stalemate. It offered a flicker of hope, a fleeting illusion that was utterly obliterated by Napoleon's crushing victory at Friedland in June. The Treaty of Tilsit that followed was a masterstroke for Napoleon. Russia pledged its allegiance to France, and Prussia was left to suffer under harsh penalties, its humiliation complete. After Friedland, Napoleon delivered a final insult to Prussia's pride. He stripped them not only of their military stores, but of vast swaths of territory, leaving the kingdom crippled and diminished. The land east of the Elbe was surrendered without contest. Napoleon absorbed the western territories into his newly forged Confederation of the Rhine, reshaping the map of Europe to suit his will. In the east, Napoleon carved out the Duchy of Warsaw, gifting the Poles a semblance of independence, though it came at the cost of becoming vassals to French rule. While the Poles welcomed their regained lands and the recognition that came with them, the weight of French domination left a bitter taste, a reminder that their freedom was only partial. The twin battles of Jena and Auerstadt marked one of Napoleon's most resounding triumphs. In a single day, he obliterated an entire army, leaving nothing but shattered remnants in his wake. Yet, despite its military brilliance, the victory did not deliver the political dominance Napoleon had envisioned. Napoleon believed that Prussia's annihilation would force Britain to recognize the futility of resistance and bring them to the negotiating table. But Britain stood firm, refusing to yield. In response, Napoleon tightened the noose, issuing the Berlin Decree to reinforce his continental system and choke European trade with Britain even further. The decree was ruthless in its scope, ordering the confiscation of all British assets on the continent and banning neutral nations from engaging in commerce with Britain. London countered with the Orders in Council, a sweeping edict that prohibited neutral nations from trading with France or its territories, escalating the economic conflict into a full-scale trade war. The resulting economic warfare engulfed Europe and rippled across the Atlantic, ensnaring the United States, the most prominent neutral trader between the warring powers. The relentless strain of trade restrictions and Britain's naval blockade of Europe ultimately dragged the United States into its own conflict, the War of 1812. Yet from the ashes of Prussia's humiliation, a profound transformation began to take root, one that would alter the course of military history. Before the catastrophe, a handful of Prussian officers had sounded the alarm, warning that their military was a relic, ill-suited to face the evolving realities of warfare. Their warnings, however, fell on deaf ears, drowned out by arrogance and complacency. At the forefront of these prophetic voices stood Major General Gerhard von Scharnhorst, a man of vision in an army mired in tradition. In the wake of the Treaty of Tilsit, Frederick William, now painfully aware of his kingdom's failings, entrusted Scharnhorst with leading the Military Reorganization Commission, a task that would reshape Prussia's future. Joined by 4 like-minded reformers, Scharnhorst embarked on a bold and systematic overhaul of the Prussian military, determined to transform it from an instrument of defeat into a model of excellence. Scharnhorst understood that greatness could not depend on luck or the whims of talentless kings. To safeguard the army's future, he and his allies conceived the General Staff, an institution designed to ensure that leadership would be guided by merit, training, and intellect. No longer would noble lineage or social standing dictate an officer's rise. Instead, promotion would hinge on talent and rigorous education, ensuring that only the most capable men would command Prussia's armies. By elevating competence above privilege, The General Staff would place the most skilled officers in positions of command and advisory roles, equipping them to guide their superiors or mitigate the damage caused by poor orders from above. Scharnhorst's vision outlived him. When he passed in 1813, his mantle was taken up by the fiery and determined August von Gneisenau, who carried the reforms forward with relentless energy. In the aftermath of Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo in 1815, Gneisenau ensured the full realization of Scharnhorst's vision, embedding the General Staff as the heart of Prussia's military machine. The General Staff became the nerve center of Prussian warfare, responsible for meticulous planning, seamless coordination between branches, and maintaining constant operational readiness. Institutions of advanced military education were established, scouring the ranks for promising officers and shaping them into leaders capable of meeting the demands of modern warfare. The introduction of war games elevated the Army's readiness to unprecedented heights. Meanwhile, a dedicated military history division ensured that past errors would be studied and avoided. Prussian observers traveled to battlefields across Europe, dissecting victories and defeats alike to extract the lessons of both history and the present. Through these reforms, the Prussian General Staff emerged as the finest military institution of the 19th century, its very structure designed to enshrine excellence and adaptability as the foundation of its power. The results were undeniable. Prussia's rapid and crushing victories against Denmark in 1864, Austria in 1866, and France in 1870 shocked the world and proved the transformative power of the General Staff. By the dawn of the 20th century, no military power could afford to ignore the Prussian model, and nations across the globe raced to establish their own general staffs. And so the fields of Jena became the funeral pyre of Frederick the Great's once mighty army. From its ashes rose a new force, a reformed and reborn Prussian military that would dominate the 19th century and carve its name into the pages of military history.